Howdy, folks. All right. This week we jump into the actual Civil War. The Civil War begins in 1861 officially. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about is 1860. It's a nice, even, round year for you to remember. If you remember that the Civil War happens between 1860 and 1865, it'll help you put everything else into a great perspective. So keep that 5-year frame, 1860 to 1865, in your brain, and it'll help you sound smart later on. Okay, so like I said, 1860 is when Lincoln was elected president. That was kind of the last straw. Here's important information. When we talk about the Union, we're talking about the North. They were called the Union because they were the states that still stayed united together in the United States. Those green states, for the most part, were called the Confederacy. We talked about the word Confederation a lot earlier in the year when we talked about like the Iroquois Confederacy and such. A confederation is a group of individual states working together. This is really important for the people in the South. The people in the South believed that they had rights as individual states to decide what they wanted to do, specifically for slavery. So there was a bit of a rallying cry in the South that the Union, the United States, Washington, Lincoln, Washington D.C., not George Washington, and Lincoln were doing too much to force the South to do what they wanted. So a lot of people in the South said, we have our own rights as states, specifically to have slaves. And the word secede means to leave the Union. So if I'm going to secede from the United States, I'm going to become my own country. So this is the map of the 1860 election. You see down here the key says that Lincoln won these states. A guy named Bell won these states. There weren't just a Republican and Democrat running against each other. There were actually 4 different people running against each other. And you saw a little bit of this in your lessons last week. But that's a little kind of in the weeds for our topic. Stephen Douglas was the guy that Lincoln was debating in our lessons last week. He only won Missouri. And then down in the South, this guy named Breckinridge was kind of the official slavery candidate. And he was running for president. He won all of these states. If you go and look at a map of elections in today's time, these states still kind of vote as blocks, where these states up in the top generally today are voting Democratic, except for in the last election, Trump won a couple of these, and that's why he was able to pull off the upset victory. But then you've got these states voting Democratic as well, and down here, all these states vote Republican. The divide in our country has been there from the start, and it's still there today. That's why learning about this stuff is important for understanding how our country works today. Notice these states were not organized as states yet officially. They were still territories, so they didn't get to vote yet. Okay. So in 1860, Lincoln was elected president. 4 men ran for president: a Northern Democrat, that was Stephen Douglas, a Southern Democrat, an Independent, and Lincoln, who was a Republican. The Republican Party was a brand new party at the time. It was like an upstart party. It was not one of the big parties. So for him to win was kind of a shock. And because there were 4 different candidates, it kind of split up the vote, and Lincoln was the one that won the votes in the North, which had the most population, and therefore he won. He did not win half of the votes because there were 4 people running. He didn't get to 50%, which is something that's it's a little frustrating for people to have a president who didn't win half of the country. People get frustrated by that. It's happened a few times recently, as a matter of fact. So because he was so radical, Southerners became very fearful that anti-slavery Republicans would try and change their way of life. Okay, I want you to stop and think for a moment. If you have scratch paper near you or something you can write on your computer, go ahead and write the answer down. I want you to pause the video and think. Lincoln was elected president. He was a Republican, and this was a new party that was anti-slavery. How do you think the South was going to respond? Okay, let's find out how they responded. Okay, here is a quote from the governor of a state, South Carolina in the South. South Carolina was the first to leave the Union. They kind of made a big step. So here's what he says. That the only alternative left, in my judgment, is the secession of South Carolina from the federal union. The indications of many of the southern states justify the conclusion that the secession of South Carolina would be immediately followed, if not adopted, simultaneously by them, and ultimately by the entire South. The state has, with great unanimity, declared that she has the right to peaceably secede, and no power on earth can rightfully prevent it. So he's saying that South Carolina is going to leave the federal union, and that he says a bunch of other states are going to follow after. Okay, so here's what Lincoln says in his very first address as president. He says, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." So he's saying, in response to states saying that they're going to leave, he's saying that it's your choice to have civil war, that the government will not attack you if you do not leave, and that if you leave, you will become the aggressors, the people who have chosen war. There's a lot of arguments about this. Of course, people argue that Abraham Lincoln could have just let the states leave and not gone to war. It's true that the southern states were not going to invade the North. That was not their plan. They wanted to leave the United States in order to protect their way of life, which involved slavery. But to Lincoln, that was not possible. He did not want to be the person who resided over a country that split in half. So he chose. He said, "If you go to war, or if you split, we are going to war." This is a part of a document that was written to make the official split of South Carolina from the rest of the country. It says, "A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states of the north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. He is to be entrusted with the administration of the common government because he has declared that the government cannot endure permanently half slave, half free." Remember, that was a quote from his famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. "And that the public mind must rest in the belief that slavery is, in the course of ultimate extinction. The guarantees of this Constitution will then no longer exist. The equal rights of the states will be lost. The slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government or self-protection, and the federal government will have to become their enemy." So, again, yes, the Civil War is about protecting states' rights, specifically the rights of states to hold slaves. So there's an argument out there today that says that the Civil War was only about protecting states' rights, and that it wasn't about slavery. That is revisionism. That is not true. The Civil War was specifically fought to protect slavery in the South.